Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, if you were to watch a mainstream media here in the United States over the last 24 hours, much of the mainstream media, including military analysts, are talking about the envelopment operation by the Ukrainian military that is happening near Bakhmut. They are alleging, again, here in the U.S., that Bakhmut is being enveloped. A double envelopment operation is underway from both the north and south of Bakhmut. Now, I'm going to jump over to the Deep State map, which is, again, essentially a pro-Ukrainian run site that updates the map according to Ukrainian intel that comes in. And we're going to jump over where you, the viewer, can kind of see what exactly is happening, at least according to this map. Now, the areas in blue are areas that have been retaken by Ukrainian forces, allegedly been retaken by Ukrainian forces. The gray area is areas that are contested, and obviously the reddish-orange area is areas controlled by Russian forces. So if we look at this, just a first-hand glimpse of what's happening. I'll get rid of this here real quick. There are no Ukrainian forces to the north and south of Bakhmut. Essentially, the Russians are conducting the envelopment operation to the west of Bakhmut against the last vestiges of Ukrainian forces that are still defending the western outskirts of Bakhmut. The Russians are firmly in control of both central, eastern, and western Bakhmut, including the administrative district, the railway line that runs through the western part of the city. And the fighting that is continuing is in the far western outskirts of the city. And if you look at this area, again, 24 hours ago, this was not contested. This was an area where Ukrainian forces were dug in. And if we look at what's happened, again, over the last, go back to the 7th, and just pay attention to this area here, and especially this area as it turns to gray. Okay, that means it's contested. The fighting is now has been pushed further west in this area. Now, the areas that Ukrainian forces have had success is to the southwest of Bakhmut in trying to push back this Russian enveloping operation that is taking place. Again, this is not a Ukrainian enveloping operation. It's an attempt by the Ukrainians to push back this double envelopment by the Russian forces. And we have received word that, in fact, two field-grade leadership individuals, colonels from the Russian military, were actually killed over the last 24 hours. I believe a brigade commander was, in fact, killed in ongoing engagements between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces. So the fighting is very, very intense and is ongoing. Now, have the Ukrainians taken any major terrain features? Have they taken any major towns? No, they haven't. They haven't. These battles that we're seeing are essentially happening in open fields. So here's an example of an area that was taken by Ukrainian forces. If you look at just the measurements in terms of the area, you're looking at 736 meters, about the distance of fairly accurate rifle fire with maybe an optic, definitely within the engagement ranges of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Okay, not a great distance, not a strategic victory by any sort of the imagination. Again, a tactical pushback or pullback by Russian forces in these open fields that are taking place. If you look up here to the further to the north, again, movements in open fields. And if you look at the distance that is taking place here, 591 meters. So you're talking about gains. You're talking about success by the Ukrainian military that is being measured in quite literally meters. Not kilometers, meters, hundreds of meters. And in the south, where you kind of have some of the, the fighting that was taking place between the 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade and the Ukrainian 3rd Azov Brigade, again, as well, in some cases, if you look in this area here, that have been taken by the Ukrainians, 170 meters. Now, again, if you listen to the news here in the States, you hear about this double envelopment operation taking place by the Ukrainians. Now, you may look at that within that context in this area, but that's not Bakhmut. Bakhmut's up here. Okay? So the Ukrainians are focusing on the salient that is occupied by the Russian 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade. Now, is that military operation designed to envelop Bakhmut from the south? No, it's not. It's designed to attack the salient. Now, if they are able to defeat the 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade or other elements of the Russian military that would come to the aid of that Russian brigade and push back the salient to where it's on a almost a vertical line parallel with Bakhmut, then you could possibly talk about an envelopment of Bakhmut from the south, and that would involve seizing control of this town and then pushing to this road that leads south of Bakhmut. But that hasn't been done yet. We're not at that point. So to talk about and discuss the envelopment of Bakhmut by Ukrainian forces, it's you're being misled by a false narrative in the mainstream media. That's not what's happening on the ground. Have there been Ukrainian successes in this area? Well, I mean, if you articulate, and if you have the perception that a gain of a few hundred meters is success, then yeah, I guess you could say that. But I think the reason why we're seeing this, and we're seeing this narrative being talked about and discussed in the mainstream media, it's because the large counteroffensive by the Ukrainian military has been paused. So, as opposed to discussing why the Ukrainians are not launching this major counteroffensive, they're bringing in this narrative of success that is happening in very, very limited areas south and north of Bakhmut. But again, these are tactical engagements that are taking place in this area, and for some reason it's getting a lot of attention. And probably the reason it's getting a lot of attention is because the Ukrainians are trying to redirect attention from the counteroffensive that didn't happen. And there are a number of reasons why that is not taking place. One of those reasons is the large-scale use of air power and cruise missiles and drone strikes by the Russian military against Ukrainian staging areas. And then at the same time, again, as I've talked about before, there is a component of both the Ukrainian military and Western leaders as well, military leaders, that are saying if the Ukrainians launch this large-scale counteroffensive in the south, it could ultimately fail and lead to a destruction of a great number of rebuilt or newly deployed Ukrainian brigades. So they've hit this pause button right now. Now, will that continue to pause? Difficult to say at this point. Another interesting piece of information coming out of the conflict was the apparent or reported shoot down of Russian aircraft in the northern sector of operations near. Go back over to the deployment map, and that is going to be. Get back up here in the Bryansk Oblast. Now, allegedly, what we're hearing, and some of this is coming out, obviously, out of Ukrainian sources, is that 4 Russian aircraft were shot down over Russian territory. And that leads one to believe that possibly, if we do learn this is in fact true, and not simply, again, a false narrative of untruthful information, that allegedly at least one Su-35, one Su-34, and 1 or 2 helicopters may have been shot down, again, over Russian territory. And what some are saying is that the Ukrainians have either moved up S-300s or they have deployed possibly Patriot missile systems closer to the border with the Russian Federation. That's possible. It could have been a Buk system as well. But you have to believe that in any case, the Russians are conducting large-scale electronic warfare missions in this area as well. So it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to redeploy those assets closer to the Russian border, and some are calling it a trap, that this was done with intent. But again, we don't know if it happened or not. Once we verify if in fact a Su-35, a Su-34, and a number of assisting electronic warfare helicopters were indeed shot down, we'll obviously have a look at that and report it. But it's interesting to see that on a number of new news outlets as I present today. We're hearing that now. Has not been confirmed, but again, we're looking into that, finding out what happened. Is it a change in Ukrainian strategy? We have seen the Ukrainians deploy its air defense assets towards larger cities, Kiev, Lviv, other areas. Now, is it possible that the Ukrainians are moving air defense assets near Chernihiv for a possible operation in the north? You have to look at that. Why would the Ukrainians, if we do find out that in fact 3 or 4 Russian aircraft were shot down over Bryansk Oblast in Russian territory by Ukrainian air defense systems, then the question is why were those systems moved into this area? Why were those Ukrainian systems moved into this area? So difficult to say. Still fragments of information coming in. We can't verify anything as of yet, but as soon as we can verify, we'll get probably a better picture on what Ukrainian system was used, depending on where and if the Russian aircraft were shot down. We'll be able to tell, what's the distance from Ukrainian territory to how deep into Russian territory that these aircraft were shot down, reportedly by Ukrainian sources over Bryansk in this area. But nothing has been confirmed yet, and we're still keeping an eye on what happened in that area. But we continue to see, obviously, the heavy fighting in Bakhmut. It looks like the Ukrainians have at least temporarily hit the pause button on any sort of large-scale offensive operations. I got a feeling that that things are really going to pick up around August. Even if you look at some of the reports coming out of by U.S. Department of Defense personnel that are reporting on Russian troop dispositions, troop strength. Well, they're reporting that overall the Russian ground forces has expanded. It's much bigger in terms of size than it was at the start of the conflict. So, for instance, We were reporting in the early phases of the Russian operation that the Russians had around anywhere from in excess of 100 to 150 battalion tactical groups, more or less, depending on what sources you were looking at, deployed for operations inside of Ukraine. Now, the U.S. Department of Defense is now reporting that the Russians essentially have about 400 plus battalion-sized groupings inside of Ukraine, with an additional 100 battalions. So again, you're looking at excess of 500 battalions, okay, that are in operation near or inside of Ukraine. Far larger than the force that originally went into the that were used at the onset of the conflict. So the Russian army is expanding; it's getting bigger, and I think the perception of a degraded Russian force is being exasperated by for instance, the May Day parade. Right? We saw one T-34. Now, does one T-34 in a parade, does that indicate that Russia is having equipment problems? No, there's probably other reasons why the Russians placed one tank in that May Day parade. The Russians, if they wanted to put 100 tanks in that parade, main battle tanks, they could have. But they didn't, and for their own reasons, they did that. And I don't believe it has to do with the inability to provide tanks for that parade. I mean, we know the Russians have dozens of up to 30 operational T-34s for parades in the Russian Federation. So why didn't they use 30 T-34s? They could have used 5 T-34s, but they didn't. And they absolutely could have used T-14 Armadas. They could have used T-90s. They could have used any variety of tanks in that parade. But for some reason, they chose not to use any of those tanks when they could have. And is that a sign that they're running out of equipment? No, I don't believe it is. Again, I believe it was another reason that they used that lone T-34. And I'm sure someone in the comment section will explain just why the Russians did that. And I think it was taken out of context in terms of the why behind that. But we'll continue to watch what is happening in the eastern frontal areas of operation. Let me go back to the deep state map. Again, we're watching things in Bakhmut. It may look like the Ukrainians, again, tried some sort of envelopment operation or the early stages of an operation to the south and north of Bakhmut, but it hasn't achieved that as of yet. Okay, this is what the map looks like. Again, the Russians still control Bakhmut. All of Bakhmut, all of the western portion that was under Ukrainian control is now contested. I mean, there's just this one sliver of area that is essentially 283 meters. 283 meters of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 apartment buildings that are controlled by Ukrainian forces and are not contested in an active war space. So that's what's happening on the ground, and this is a Ukrainian operated site that reports on who controls what. And this could look actually a little bit different if it's coming from the Russian side. And we're not seeing that. So that's where we sit. That's where we stand. We'll continue to follow what is happening on the ground. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.